John Pollard, and I'm the coordinator of the St Ives Memory Bay Oral History Project. This is a project which is designed to try to record in oral form testimony from people about the artists in St Ives and their links with the community. How the community and the artists interacted, how St Ives has changed since it became a base for lots of very famous artists, how St Ives has changed since the tape arrived here and so on. So we're looking at the community and the ways in which the artists used the community, became involved in the community, created their own community, and the way in which the town has changed over the last 100 or so years. The archive here in St Ives is a community archive. It's been going for about 13, 14 years, I think. And over that time they've amassed an amazing amount of material, tens of thousands of photographs which are all being digitised and are available to the public. They have a very popular local history or family history group, family history section, where people from all over the world contact them because they've got some link with St Ives. So we want St Ives Archive to become a centre of excellence, really, so that people studying artists can listen to recordings that have already been made. Part of the funding also establishes a website, and the website will contain extracts of recordings.
Ben Nicholson used to always wear a white cap and a white, a bit like, I used to think he based himself a bit on Picasso or something like that, you know, with these old type artists, these continental artists. And he used to wear a lot of white, it was a white cap, and he talked quietly, but he knew what he wanted, and he's very adamant. He insisted. I mean, you knew very well you couldn't, if you wanted something, you presented something that wasn't quite right, that wouldn't be accepted.
Establishing who's worth being interviewed has been very interesting, really. And so far we're up to over 100 people who we feel would be worthy of some kind of interview as part of the project. These have come from suggestions from the volunteers, suggestions from the partners, and suggestions from people who we've already interviewed. You know, you go and interview Mrs. So-and-so up the road, she says you must interview Flora living next door, and so on. Heritage Lottery funding is based on the principle that we've got some money to buy equipment and set up a project, but that we use volunteers and volunteer hours to do the recording. So we've got about 12 volunteers based here at St Ives, and a further group of volunteers based at University College Falmouth, who are one of the partners. And they have come from all sorts of sources. Some have contacted me because they've seen information about the project. I've given talks to groups, particularly during the St Ives Festival, and that's attracted people. They've seen publicity about the work that we've been doing, or they were already involved in the archive or involved in the art world. Celia will just describe briefly a reluctant interviewee, because often people are very anxious about the process, and we don't force anybody to do anything, but we do sometimes have to do some convincing, and we have to be quite patient.
Yeah.
So I know you're doing one at the minute, Celia.
I've only done 2 or 3 interviews so far, and after I'd done the interview, the person being interviewed said they weren't happy with it at all. And again, it was just a matter of negotiating with them. And in the end, they decided that they'd do another interview and make it better, so that we redid the whole interview.
We're using the state-of-the-art modern recorders. They're all instantly digitized. We record onto a WAV file. Recordings usually take place either in the home of the interviewee or the workplace of the interviewee, or in many cases as well, a sort of third option is the archive or the place where they did work, so the Leach Pottery or a studio. Once a volunteer has said, I want to record whoever, Mrs. Smith, then they first of all need to check with me that nobody else is doing that interview, and then they go off and make contact. The essential element of making contact is to make people understand and feel comfortable about what they're doing. This is not a Jeremy Paxman, we're going to pin you to the wall and find out the truth interview. This is very much this is your opportunity for a conversation with me, which will be recorded. It is people's reminiscence, and it's very important that the interviewee understands that they own the copyright to this recording until they give it up. And there's a great deal of information about ethics and copyright and data protection that we really have to consider in what we're doing. And we do get all interviewees to sign a release form so that the information is then released. When it comes back here, it's downloaded on the computer, we've got an external hard drive, and it's also printed onto a archive quality gold CD, so that every recording is kept in 3 different areas. I think what we're doing is fun, it's important, it's establishing the record, it's providing training in skills for people, it's engaging with a very wide range of personalities. We did a wonderful day with teachers at Tate where we played them some recordings of people talking about Ben Nicholson, and indeed Ben Nicholson talked a little bit about himself, and then showed them some of the Ben Nicholson work in the exhibition at Tate. And again, they drew on both pieces of stimulus material, if you like, to produce their own piece of artwork. And that kind of study scheme of work can be established, written up, and used, in schools forever as a means of appreciating the work of Ben Nicholson. Well, we're trying to do a lot of work with the 6 schools in what's called the St Ives cluster. So, for instance, with St Eunice School, I've recently done some recording where they've been comparing photographs of Carpus Bay, particularly years ago, before it was developed, before the growth of the houses and the bungalows, and then they've been talking about that onto a recording machine, and we've made a little CD about that kind of information, and that's going to continue as part of this project. Well, obviously, a lot of the changes in St Ives are physical, and we can show that through the use of film. There's a long list of places that we're getting people who are talking about them, and we feel that with film we can show them. Barbara Hepworth's studio, Barbara Hepworth's garden, the studios that were dotted around St Ives, the streets themselves, this archive, the Arts Club. In terms of film as well, it can add understanding. We've recorded, for instance, a fantastic description of how the kilns at the Leach Pottery worked before the coming of electricity and gas kilns, where they were fired by wood. And we can't replicate that, but we can give a deeper impression of what it must have been like. As far as this film is concerned, we want to give a flavour of what we've done.
I mean, I must say, when I first came here, they weren't firing this kiln. Over here was a big oil kiln, a big square oil kiln that was being fired when I came. And that was fired probably about every month, 6 weeks, depends how busy you were. But then after here about a year or so, probably 2 years, they decided they wanted to start refiring, because the trouble with this kiln, it's wonderful, but it takes the pottery staff to fire it. It's in man hours. It's very it uses up a lot of man hours, and it's very expensive in labour. It's fired by oil mainly, but then stoked with wood. These 3 chambers are filled with pots. There's furniture. They're empty at the moment, and through there you can see some of the furniture just starting, and you gradually build up these stacks of shelves until the whole thing is full. And then the doorways are bricked up by just bricks like this, and each doorway is bricked up. But there is a stoke hole left just about here, and a spire hole up here to look in through how you're stoking. The stoke hole was for when about It was probably about 1100 degrees centigrade, which is it's sort of like a bright orange colour. That's when you really wanted to start to put heavy reduction in the kiln. So you'd start stoking this kiln with wood, intervals of probably about quarter of an hour. You'll throw in the wood, and then this enormous pressure would build up in the kiln, and suddenly it would just erupt with flame, bursting out of every orifice. I mean, here's a spire hole, here's a spire hole. I mean, they'd have bungs in them, and of course there was a spire hole here, and it'd be bursting out of those, and then everywhere, as you can see, it's not exactly a Hovis home built thing. So out through every crack would be becoming these flames, and of course there'd be smoke belching out as well, and there'd be smoke going up. It throbbed. It was alive, this kiln. It was a fantastic thing to fire and really exciting.
So places are very important. Portsmouth Studios, the sail lofts that were made into studios, the streets, the harbour, down along and up along the two areas of St Ives.
And the tide will rise, and we'll wipe our weary eyes, and you'll decide what coat you should be wearing. And the swell, it's deceiving, and my eyes are not believing, as the little fishes gather round the town, and the rain washes down along, and the seagulls cry down along, and the moon casts shadows down along.
St Ives School of Painting has been going for most of the last century, and again that has had a tremendous effect on many locals as well as on the artists who work there and learn there.
I'm Roy Ray. I'm at the St Ives School of Painting that I've run since the mid-70s. So here we are in its 71st year, and it's had many thousands of people through its doors. And one thing about St Ives which makes it unique in terms of artist colonies is that there has always been a fresh crop of younger artists moving in at various times, and it reseeds this community. I can only tell you from hearsay about the first 30 years, because Leonard Fuller started it in 1938. He was an established Royal Academy trained portrait painter, a very successful one. And his wife was also Royal Academy trained. She painted under the name Marjorie Mostyn. So the school for the first 30 years of its life had this bias towards the traditional ways of painting. Quite a number of successful painters have spent time in this very studio. Even those who had already become established still came along to the School of Painting and spent some time here, maybe just taking use of the facilities. And one thinks of Terry Frost and Dennis Mitchell, whose studio this was before it was the School of Painting, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham. Even in recent years, Sandra Blow would sometimes turn up at the evening life class on a Wednesday. Peter Lanyon, the only St Ives born abstract painter to gain an international reputation, spent some of his younger days in this school with Leonard Fuller. I imagine if went back through the old school registers, there would be a lot of other names that people who went on to achieve very good things in the world of art. All these painters were part of the community. They were part of our everyday life, and for a lot of years, in the wintertime when there wasn't much happening, I would run a monthly artist lunch in this studio. So you'd see all these painters and writers and historians and critics and local artists and amateurs and professionals all together in this studio, having a cheese pâté or some cheese and pâté ploughmans or something like that, and basically having a monthly sort of social gathering, and it spread right across all the various artistic divides which communities like this inevitably have. So this old building has some very nice times. It could tell a few stories.
The economy of the area has been changed by artists. If you came to St Ives before the railway in 1877, then it was a very small, remote fishing port. The railway brought tourists, and in the mid-20th century it was very much a bucket and spade place. Closed in the winter, lively in the summer. Whereas now it's very much an artist's place, with the Tate bringing all year round tourism and international tourism to the town. So the economy has changed.
In the 1840s and 50s, this area was nothing but grass. And the first thing they built here was actually a gasworks. It was a very small gasworks, just here on this site. And the next thing they built was the cemetery, if you could call it building a cemetery. And then it wasn't until many years later, when they stopped manufacturing gas, that they built the meadow flats, which surround the gallery now. The last part of the gasworks was actually demolished as late as 1985. Until that time, there was still a big gas holder, and that finally came down, and the place was completely derelict. When it was decided that there would be a Tate Gallery in St Ives, although it wasn't originally going to be called a Tate Gallery, but it was going to house a collection of the Tate Gallery's St Ives paintings and sculpture, the architects who were charged with this came along here, and they saw the space and thought it would be the most marvellous place to have a gallery, because it would look out on the very view that artists over the last 100 years had been looking at when they were making many of their paintings. For the record, the architects were Catherine Heron, who was Patrick Heron's daughter, and her husband Julian Feary, and I think it was Julian who decided on this. One of the most favourite parts of this gallery is looking out towards the sea from where I'm sitting in the rotunda. The amazing thing is that actually from here you can't see the sea, but there's this extraordinary rectangle between the columns of the gallery and the roof, and you'll see the sky only. We can hear the sea, and especially at this time of the day when the tide is in. And looking at the rectangle, you see clouds scurrying across, but also sometimes there are no clouds, and you've just got the most brilliant blue. And it is one of the most amazing parts of the building, I think, and I never get tired of sitting here and looking at the view out there. There was a competition to choose an architect for the building, and about 5 architects put in applications, and the winners were husband and wife team of Eldred Evans and David Shalev. They were well known down here because they had completed the Crown Courts at Truro only a little bit previously, and they also have a flat here because Eldred's father, Merlin Evans, was an artist who used to come here regularly and bring Eldred down when she was young. The area that we are looking at here, which is known as the Rotunda, was exactly in the same place as one of the large gas cylinders that had been here, gas holders. But she also wanted the whole experience of being in the gallery to be rather like the experience of walking around St Ives, and that therefore you've got different floors and different levels and staircases and wonderful glimpses of St Ives as you go up and around. And it's very, very similar, as I said, to actually being in St Ives.
number 3 Porthmere Studios on Porthmere Beach in St Ives, and it's one of the best and most famous studios in the country. There are 10 studios in the complex and fishing cellars underneath as well. And so it's a unique relationship between artists and fishermen. So the artists that have been in here have included some of the sort of who's who of 20th century modern art, like Ben Nicholson, Francis Bacon, Patrick Heron, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, Bruno Casey, you know, the list goes on, Terry Frost. So lots of really big names. And so in a place like this, for instance, if you make a line drawing, it's very difficult to not feel Ben Nicholson sort of telling you what, you have to kind of, push him to the back of your mind and try and make your own drawing, things like that. Okay. And people who are very influenced by the kind of coastal-based abstraction that was going on in the 50s and 60s, they must find that difficult to get away from Lanyon and Hilton and those kind of wonderful shapes and the way the paint felt like the sea and the air and all that kind of stuff. So I think it is quite infectious, and you have to be careful what you catch. There's mad scrawlings on the walls and lots of paint all over the floor now. But there must be, because the floorboard's the same, there must be the history on there, there must be.
It's terrific, isn't it?
Yeah. Artists tend to find places that are good to look at and where they can afford to live and make work, and then sneak in and take over net lofts. So these are where the enormous, I think the seine nets were kept, and apparently they were huge quarter-mile long nets, so they needed this enormous space. And the artists saw these spaces and saw the potential, put skylights in, and started working in here. So people like Julius Olson and co were the early painters in here. I think it's just possible that maybe the fishermen didn't need this amount of room for storing their gear, because the way of fishing changed. When I first moved into this studio, number 3, I got a card from a friend saying, have fun in it. And he'd found a bit in one of the biographies of Bacon, where he'd sent a card to somebody himself in London saying, I'm painting in the best room in St Ives. Apparently, Francis Bacon he'd changed dealers, he'd been with one dealer, selling his work, showing his work for a long time, and he'd been in a very stormy relationship. And he came out of both of those and was going to have his first show at Marlborough on Cork Street in London, and I don't know whether Marlborough encouraged him to go and get a bit of fresh air, clear his head, dry out maybe, do some of those things. And whether St Ives appealed to him because there were exciting things going on artistically. And even though he was making a different kind of work, I think he thought, I wonder if there's anything there that I can just learn from or pick up or just, find a little bit. Picasso said, good artists don't borrow, they steal. So maybe he was coming down to see if there was anything worth nicking. And he was in this studio, I think only for about 6 months, but I think the paintings he made in here, which were shown in the Tate a couple of years ago, working in here now, you can tell they were made here because there are 3 bands of colour in the canvases, and then a sort of tortured figure, of course, writhing about at the front. But the 3 bands of colour, as soon as I saw them in the Tate, it's so clearly that. But of course, 2 studios along was Patrick Heron at the time, probably doing his drawings.
And the rain washes down along, and the seagulls cry down along, and the moon casts shadows down along.
You live right in the middle of what is Dowell.
Dowell, yes.
And that's where the artists gathered when they first came. What's it like today? Because it's a very different place, isn't it?
Yes. I suppose there was a time when Tony O'Malley and Jane O'Malley were here, when the artists met together and had all sorts of discussions, and perhaps a few of them were in the poorer society of, they didn't come in with their wealth, really. They were struggling painters around about sort of 50s and 60s and 70s. And there was a great deal of cooperation among them. I don't think it exists now. Each painter seems to be individual and very much contained in a way.
Oh, down along doesn't exist, does it really? Because it's holiday cottages and...
Yes, and we're isolated. We live there, and the next, occupation is sort of, some way away. So there's just small individual pockets, and when we go, they'll all be, down along will be deserted, really. It's a shame. Apart from the studios, I hope they'll be flourishing, and the fishermen's cellars, and the societies of artists, which are still there, and of course the Tate. So there's still a major nucleus. Well, I did hope when the Tate opened in 1993 that they would have regard to the history of the colony, but they didn't. They weren't interested in the early painters of St Ives. And you can't start a history up here and ignore the foundation. But now I think they're more sympathetic, and they've become part of the town. Whereas when they first arrived, I think there was some isolated castle in the air, But if you don't join St Ives can really damage you or turn you out in a way. But I think it's part of the community now. The Arts Club was first formed 1890 because there were so many artists here at that time, over 100, that they decided to form the club. And I was so amazed when I first joined this club in 1980 to find that there was no history written of St Ives Arts Club. And so I decided to write it up till 1930. And then I showed the publisher and they said, yes, we'll do it. Now go away and bring it right up to date. When they first occupied this top half of the building, below was a carpenter's workshop, and they had to climb a ladder to get into the building. In fact, two of the first members to sign up were Elizabeth and Stanhope Forbes, the Newlyn painters. So they came over here in droves when they understood that an arts club was to be formed. And it was for musicians, writers, painters and architects and professional people in those fields. And later on, of course, there were the Lanyons. Peter Lanyon used to do the backdrops for the stage productions, and the Leach pottery, all the Leach people were members. Bernard Leach, and then Barbara Hepworth also was a member. So it was quite a famous club in its time.
There are themes already emerging from the recordings that we've got, and we hope in the end to draw those together into some kind of book. But so the themes that are being raised or are coming to light are things why artists came to St Ives, for instance, and there's still a sort of progression of artists who come to the area to work and to live, many of them from quite a long way away. So St Ives has got that draw, and there are elements about St Ives that do that. It's a wonderful place to live. You can afford to live here. It's got fabulous light, and of course now it's got this terrific tradition of artists.
I mean, obviously artists have come to St Ives for the last 150 years. What brought you to St Ives?
Well, it was pretty mundane in a way because I was 18 and I wanted a bit of life, and I'd been down on holiday with some friends and they wanted to come down to work season. It was the first time I'd experienced the 60s really. Everyone was talking about the swinging 60s, and I was in Southgate in North London, and there was no swinging 60s there. You come here and it was flower power and boutiques and people with bells. It'd come from beatniks to hippies by then, and it was really lively. I mean, it was a fantastic place. blew my mind really, you know, from a mundane life in London.
And what brought you to St Ives, Joan?
Oh, well, I met an artist. But that was sort of it wasn't quite by accident, because I was living in Birmingham at the time, and I had a gallery, and somebody introduced me to John Emanuel's work and said, wouldn't it be a good idea to show his work in Birmingham? And I came down to visit. I'd never been here in my life before. I'd hardly ever even been to Cornwall. I was a Londoner. And I met John, and we got on really well, and a few months later I moved here permanently, and I wouldn't go back to living in a city. And it's certainly a very vibrant place, but there's more to it than just the artists, and I think the important thing is the community as well. And I think that when we raised money for the Tate, that showed how a community can work together to do something that is for the benefit of everybody.
I first discovered St Ives by holidaying in Bodmin, which is quite high, Bodmin Moor, and noticed that the sky was always brighter towards the west. So I drove down, this was in the early 60s, so I drove down here unaware that St Ives was an artist colony, until I discovered it. Walking around the town, there are galleries everywhere. I mean, at that time, I was what you would call an enthusiastic weekend painter. And there was this place full of them. It's a great place to live. But I suppose the strongest factor might be the heritage, the fact that there is a place where going to work in the studio each day is considered normal.
We came, Terry and my husband and I came for a Christmas holiday, and we stayed at the Portminster Hotel, and we were walking on the beach, Portminster Beach, in brilliant sunshine, and our two daughters had sort of more or less left home, and we were thinking of something else. We wanted to change our lives, and we almost turned to each other and said, we could move here. And we decided on that. Terry had always wanted to paint full time, and I had always wanted to write. And when we got here, it was like plugging into some magical aesthetic, some creative energy that we were able to draw from. So I think that's what other painters and writers found here, and they could flourish here.
There was a strange other family in our village in the Midlands who had connections down here, and it was Rachel Nicholson, one of the triplets of Ben Nicholson and Barbara Happy. And they brought me down on holiday with them in 1978, and that was that. Really. That was enough.
Brilliant.
And it's their fault. So if anybody's unhappy about me being here, go and see them.
The 6 partners within the project all have different requirements really. They've all signed up to the idea that at the end there will be an archive of oral testimony. But the use of that work is different from partner to partner. The Tate, for instance, we're doing a lot of work on education, and I think that they would like to see within schools a continuing learning resource based on oral testimony as well as visual material. And we're working quite actively with Tate Education here in St Ives to create that kind of resource. The archive obviously wants to have an archive which people can use. University College Falmouth want to pursue the use of oral testimony as a research tool. You know, people who are writing their dissertations and doing their studies are very used to using different forms of material, but really oral testimony about artists in this area is something which needs to be sort of pioneered in a way, in that sense of study skills and use for study. And University College Falmouth are trying to pursue that. Places like the Portsmouth Studio, the Leach Pottery, and the St Ives School of Painting want material which explains their history and their background, which they can use then for promotional or instructive purposes within their own establishments. So different needs under the umbrella of creating one whole art.